Thank you all for coming to this annual observance of Memorial Day at Woodland Pond. We appreciate your attendance and thank the members of the Interfaith Committee, resident musicians, and resident veterans for combining their talents to lead this program today. Our observance is designed to include the audience as active participants in the program as well. And we encourage you to take part at the designated times in the printed program. We will begin with the presentation of the colors. Please stand if you can. Thank you. Color Guard, advance. Let us join together in saying the Pledge of Allegiance, then in singing our national anthem. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. Cal.
Memorial Day began as Decoration Day and can be traced back to before the end of the Civil War, when women's groups in the South decorated the graves of fallen Confederate soldiers. One of the great hymns of that dark time in American history was written in December 1861 as Julia Ward Howe sat in her hotel room in Washington, D.C., listening to soldiers singing John Brown's Body to the tune of an old camp meeting hymn as they marched to the front. As she listened, a poem shaped itself in her mind, and she rapidly wrote it down on a scrap of paper and submitted it to the Atlantic Monthly magazine. She called it the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Let's sing together the first verse of this immortal hymn and be reminded of that terrible conflict that pitted brother against brother and sorely tested our nation. Another favorite Civil War tune, Chanting on the Old Campground, also known as Chanting Tonight, was a particular favorite of enlisted men in the Union Army. It was written in 1863 by Walter Kittredge and first performed that year at Old High Rock, Lynn, Massachusetts. Let's all sing it together. Chanting. New York was the first state to recognize Decoration Day in 1873. By 1890, northern states observed the holiday. The southern states honored their dead days on separate days until after World War I. In 1882, the name was changed to Memorial Day and has lost its purely military significance. Memorial Day has become the day when we pause in respectful tribute to those who have walked these paths before, pay respect to all who have died in war or in peace as soldiers or as civilians.
World War I, the war to end all wars, raged from 1914 to 1918. Before it ended with an armistice signed at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. America had sustained 53,500 battle deaths and 63,000 deaths from disease and accidents. European casualties ran into the millions. Many songs came out of World War I, and one favorite is a long, long trail. Despite its close identification with World War I, was actually composed the year before war was declared. Stoddard King and Zoe Elliott were then Yale undergraduates and created it as nothing more than a sentimental piece to be sung at a fraternity banquet. First published in England, it was sung and marched to by British Tommies well before being picked up by American doughboys when they went to fight in Europe in 1917. Let's all sing, "There's a Long, Long Trail." World War I's greatest anthem is said to be "Till the Boys Come Home," written in 1914, and later more commonly known as "Keep the Home Fires Burning." The tune was composed by British composer Ivor Novelli at the age of 21 when he competed with his mother, a celebrated leader of the Welsh Ladies Choir, to compose a war song. American poet Lena Gilbert Ford completed the lyrics. The song gained the hearts of the public from its first performance, and by February 1916, over 1 million copies of the sheet music had been sold and the song translated into at least 6 languages. Bill Toole will sing the song for us right now.
They were summoned from the hillside, they were pulled in from the glen, and the country found them.
Flanders, in the north of France, was the scene of one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. One of the few things that survived the bloodshed was the poppy flower. The sight of this delicate, vibrant flower growing on the shattered battlefield caught the attention of John McCrae, a Canadian doctor serving on the battlefield, who wrote this famous poem after treating the wounded and burying the dead in Flanders Fields. It has become a tradition for us to hear this powerful poem each Memorial Day. In Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
In November 1918, 2 days before the armistice was declared at 11 o'clock on November 11th, Miss Moyna Michael was taking a break from her secretarial work in the YMC headquarters in New York City. On her desk was a copy of the Ladies' Home Journal, the November issue. She picked it up and came across a page that carried a vivid color illustration for the poem We Shall Not Sleep, later named In Flanders Field. In particular, the last few lines of the poem spoke to Moyna. To you, from failing hands, we throw the torch, be yours to hold on high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. At that moment, she made a personal pledge to keep the faith, vowing to always wear a red poppy as a sign of remembrance. The red poppy would serve as an emblem for keeping the faith with all who died. Compelled to make a note of this pledge, she hastily scribbled down a poetic response on the back of a used envelope entitled, We Shall Keep the Faith. Would you join me, please, in reading this poem together? O you who sleep in Flanders Fields, sleep, sleep, to rise anew. We caught the torch you threw, and holding high, we keep the faith with all who died. We cherish too the poppy red that grows on fields where valor led. It seems to signal to the skies that blood of heroes never dies, but lends a luster to the red of the flower that blooms above the dead in Flanders Fields. And now the torch and poppy red we wear in honor of our dead. Fear not that we have died for naught. We'll teach the lesson that ye wrought in Flanders Fields. After writing the poem, Miss Michael conceived the idea of wearing red poppies as a sign of remembrance and selling them to benefit war widows, their children, and servicemen in need. In 1922, the VFW became the first veterans group to sell poppies. 2 years later, the Buddy Poppy, an artificial poppy, was sold to benefit disabled veterans. In 1948, the U.S. Post Office honored Miss Michael by issuing a red 3-cent postage stamp with her likeness. Since the end of World War I, Memorial Day has also been known as Poppy Day, and poppies have become the official Veterans Memorial symbol. Unfortunately, the lessons taught at the fields in Flanders did not last, and the world once more engaged in a global conflict as World War II cost untold millions of lives in many countries. VE Day marked the end of war in Europe, which lasted 5 years, 8 months, and 6 days. Japan surrendered 3 months later on August 15. In all, 16 million soldiers, 300,000 of them American, and 40 million civilians died in the conflict that spanned from Europe to the Pacific.
In the dark days of 1941, the high white chalk cliffs of Dover on the English Channel coast were guideposts for the German planes that flew in a seemingly endless stream to bomb London and other England targets. At the height of the Battle of Britain, the skies above the cliffs held only terror for the British and their allies, where 2 American songwriters, Nat Burton and Walter Kent, looked forward to better days, when the bombers would be replaced by bluebirds, and created one of the most touching of the stiff upper lip songs to come out of World War II, and one we all know well. The words, though written now more than 80 years ago, still speak powerfully to the continual quest and never-ending hope for peace in our time. Let us all sing this beloved song together.
Song. It was hard to keep a stiff upper lip after World War II. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you or a family member was militarily involved in World War II. Look around. There are many hands. Now I'm going to ask you to raise the other hand if you personally lost someone in World War II. Many of us did. Many of you served. But the wars continue, and casualties continue.
During the 1950s and 60s, the days were known as part of the Cold War. There were concerns in Europe and other areas of the world, and the news continued to dominate our lives during the Cold War. Those years, 1946 to 1991, the wars between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Allies. And then there was the Korean War. It was a war between North and South Korea, 1950 to 53. The United States provided 90% of the military personnel in the Korean War. We supported the South, along with 21 countries from the United Nations. One of our veterans, President Ted Bewley.
The Korean War began in June 25th, 1950, when 75,000 Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel, which was the dividing line between North and South Korea. In July 1950, American troops entered the war on behalf of South Korea. The demilitarized zone, or the DMZ as you may know it, was established in July of 1953, supposedly ending the fighting. However, no peace treaty was ever signed, and technically they're still at war. There were approximately 3 million war fatalities and a larger proportion of civilian deaths than in World War II or the Vietnam War. American casualties were over 58,000. The United States still has a military presence stationed in South Korea. Some of our residents served in Korea. I was one of them. Many of you remember the TV show MASH. Its scenery was a good representation of the different environment our troops experienced in that war. The Korean Memorial, the statues of which, by the way, were produced in Fishkill, New York. The memorial in Washington, D.C. is a sight you'll never forget. 19 soldiers in full combat attire walking through a mined field. Surrounding the statues is a wall containing the faces of Korean soldiers, United States Korean soldiers. It is a great tribute to our Korean veterans.
How many of you had a family member involved in the Korean War? Several hands, look around. And from there, we thank those who served and those who didn't return. We are grateful. But wars continue. And how 50 years ago, can you believe it? The Vietnam War ended 50 years ago. How many of you had family members or were involved in the Vietnam War? The hands just keep going up. That's the tragedy of our war. Our resident Tom Gilder will share his experience in Vietnam.
Vietnam War began in 1955. Direct U.S. involvement ended in 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords, but the Accords were almost immediately broken, and fighting continued 2 more years. The 1975 Spring Offensive and the fall of Saigon in April of 1975 marked the end of the war for a U.S. presence. The U.S. suffered 58,200 casualties over that time span. A number of the Woodland Pond residents served in various capacities during the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, over its span, required a deployment of 2.6 million military, and at its peak in April of 1969, had 550,000 serving in country. My tour was in June of 67 to June of 68. I was there for the Tet Offensive. This war was not accepted, especially by the young, and produced a falling out between the civilians and the military. At that time, there was no honor serving your country. But time heals, and in 1982, a unique memorial was dedicated to remember those Vietnam casualties that made the ultimate sacrifice. It's composed of 72 black granite panels and lists each casualty in chronological order, beginning with July 1959 and ends with May 1975. The memorial is situated and aligned to point one side of it to the Washington Monument and the other side to the direction of the Lincoln Memorial. America faithfully remembers its men and women that have served and are in the service of their nation. The idea that we remember is essential to make to the moral core of this nation. Asking our men and women to serve, to make unimaginable sacrifices in their lives, plus the disruptions to their families, remembering is the least we can do. Your presence here today signifies this understanding, and all of us have appreciated it, and thank you.
U.S. involvement ended in 1973. The year 2000 was the first year Vietnam vets were even invited to march in the 4th of July parade. And war goes on. More recently, the Middle East Gulf War in 1990 took the lives of some of our Woodland Pond family's members. If you had someone who served in Desert Shield or Desert Storm, will you raise your hand, please? There was an international conflict in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. That armed campaign waged by 39 military coalition was spearheaded by the United States. It was Operation Desert Shield. Then there was Operation Desert Storm, aerial bombing campaign against Iraq in 1991, which ultimately led to American liberation of Kuwait. There were 292 American casualties then. 9/11, 2001, it's etched in all of our minds. But that led to further conflict in the Middle East, and was the war in Afghanistan. A reminder that nations around the world continue to to a never-ending struggle for peace. The desire for world peace was demonstrated forcefully through music in those days. Throughout the 50s and the 60s, who doesn't remember Pete Seeger's Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind. They're among some of the strongest songs of the era. They speak eloquently to the quest for peace and asking searching questions in their respective lyrics. Blowing in the Wind, written 61 years ago, continues this day to speak poignantly and yes, pointedly, not only to times of war, but to any situation involving man's indifference to man. Let's all sing those first two verses together, Blowing in the Wind.
Since the late 1950s, on the Thursday before Memorial Day, 1,200 soldiers from the 3rd U.S. Infantry placed flags next to all of the crosses and stars of David at Arlington National Cemetery. Ted Bewley, in his service, was one of those National Guard at the cemetery. They patrol the cemetery 24 hours a day until Memorial Day. At many federal and local cemeteries, scout troops of veterans organizations place flags on each grave. Here at Woodland Pond, we honor our veterans throughout the year, but especially on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, as we pay special tribute and thank them for their service to their country, to our country. A number of our resident veterans have had the inspirational experience of participating in an honor flight to Washington, D.C. One such flight in April included Bill Stevens, accompanied by his son, Mark. Bill has agreed to say a few words about his experience.
Takes a little time to get up. Before I talk about our flight, I'd like to just give you an illustration of, or give you thoughts about the honor flight itself. World War II Memorial was completed in 2005. That's about 60 years after the war ended. And most of the veterans of that war were probably in their late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the concern of many of them was how are we going to get there to see it? Honor flights were conceived by Earl Morris of Springfield, Ohio. He and others realized that many of the veterans may not be physically or financially able to see the memorial, and realized that some action had to be taken. He and a fellow pilot organized the first flight to Washington with veterans. The first flight was made up with private planes from a organization that Miller and Morris belonged. Were 17 veterans. So that was the start of honor flights. The criteria for an honor flight laid down at that time was that it must be free to the veteran and that they must be escorted or have a guardian to the memorial. Today, 17 years later, over 270,000 veterans have taken the honor flight to Washington. From about 40 states of the country. I got to be a veteran in the summer of 1951. I graduated from college and entered the Air Force and served for a little over 2 years and spent about a year or so in Japan. Never got to Korea, and I didn't volunteer for it either, so. But the flight that we took, Mark and I, was the 29th honor flight of the Hudson Valley Honor Society, and I'll turn around as more veterans have, and there it is on the back of the shirt. Our flight was approximately 85 veterans with guardians and many honor flight volunteers who were the support staff. There goes my team. Most of the veterans were Vietnam veterans because we're kind of running out of Korean and World War II. There were two World War II veterans. One was 97 and the other 101. And there were 9 Korean and I think 5 or 6 what they were called Cold War. We started out from Stewart Field as all other all of the veterans have or honor flights. Well, actually, we started at 4:45 in Montgomery at the ShopRite. So, and from there on, going to the airport at Stewart, were motorcycle brigade or and let me think here. I should follow my notes. Bagpiper groups, motorcycle groups, a police escort to the airport, and when we got there, many friends and relatives there to greet us and encourage us on. It was a very moving experience, as all other honor flight fellows will attest to. The volunteer group, I can't say enough about. They made you feel proud, they made you feel welcome, and they couldn't do enough for you. all day long. They were just outstanding, well-trained, and unbelievable people, friendly as all. So when we got to Washington, we were well fed all day long with 2 meals and a big dinner. And I guess what I would like to talk about is my feelings about it. I think one of my highlights of the day was the visit to the Arlington Cemetery and the Tomb of the Unknown and the changing of the guard. I'd have to say, before you get to that point, driving through Arlington, you've got to get lumps in your throat for all the graves that you see, miles of graves in Arlington. The changing of the guard is one of the most impressive things that I have seen. Well-disciplined, the military, and a very moving ceremony that is difficult. You just can't forget it. From there on, we went to the Korean Memorial, and has been described by Ted. That also is very moving, particularly for me, who was part of that war. And but the biggest, the most impressive was the World War II Memorial. Maybe because I grew up during the war, during the Second World War, remember when it started, how it started, where I was when we learned about it, and knew so many men who had gone, some never came back. And so when we visited that memorial, I was extremely impressed by the size of it, the organization, and one of the things that probably impressed me most was what I'll call the War of Stars. The War of Stars is made up of 448 stars, which represent 100 servicemen who served and did not return. That means 404,000 men. And then we went on to the Vietnam Memorial, which also is very moving. That black memorial is just outstanding. From there, we had a big dinner, and as I said, food all day, you know. Actually started when we got home about 9:30. There again was a big welcoming crowd who kept saying, thank you for serving, thank you for serving. And I think I have to say that the theme of our flight was the word welcome home. And welcome home, Tom referred to it, was in recognition of the Vietnam veterans who kind of got short-shifted by American public and didn't receive the due recognition that they deserved. So that was also important. Again, one other thing that surprised me was on the plane on the way back, you received a packet called mail call. And mail call consisted of letters from kids, family, about our serving, and notes on all of them, and that put a lump in my throat because I didn't know about it, didn't realize it was going to happen, and I got some nice accolades from my own family, right? So that was a trip. It was a wonderful trip. We came back at about 9:30, and I have to say it was very moving and wonderful experience for us. And I would encourage all veterans who have not served or have not gone on the honor flight to do so. As a matter of fact, I've been handed applications for the honor flight, and guardian applications, so anybody who might want to do it can pick these up anywhere, probably the concierge office. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Now, we all would like to acknowledge all of our veterans who have had the privilege of attending the honor flight, as well as the veterans who are here as new residents or have been here and have not gone on the honor flight, to please stand as they are, if they are able. First, the veterans who have gone on the honor flight. Please stand. Now, veterans who are here in the audience, residents, can you stand, please? Thank you. Pastor Lynn Mell will now lead us in a prayer and a moment of silence as we remember the fallen. Please stand.
If I might take a moment of personal privilege first. I probably dare not ask if there's anyone here who served in the First World War. My father did. And in my first life, I was a history teacher. And so I really dug into a lot of that history and came to the realization, as we're talking about all of the monuments that have been made for veterans of all the wars, there was never one made for First World War. Now, 106 years later, in 2024, the monument, the Doughboys Monument, will be dedicated in Washington, D.C. I'm a member of that group. I've contributed to it. It's going to be a beautiful monument with a mural depicting the life of a soldier from leaving home to entering into the service and the violence of war. But I'm glad we finally got around to honoring these soldiers too in that war to end all wars. Let us pray. God of all nations, your desire is for peace and justice among all people. Lest we forget, on this day remind us of the debt we owe to those who in war made the supreme sacrifice and gave their lives in defense of that vision and our nation. Gratitude is also due to those who have returned and been scarred by warfare, those who returned wounded and disillusioned, and those who mourn the loss of loved ones and the loss of a world that is still diminished with continual suffering and seems doomed to repeat a craven history of selfish domination. We also remember those men and women who acted with compassion and bravely risked their own lives for comrades, including those in the medical corps, the military chaplaincy, and those who in the aftermath of war worked tirelessly for a more peaceful nation and world. Fill the hearts of all with solemn gratitude for these heroes, so that every American life will be rededicated to the task of building a nation worthy of their service. Grant us peace in our nation, in our world, and a longing for the day when people of every language and race and faith will know you as the God of unity in the family of all nations. And to that, let us all say, Amen. And now we will take a moment of silence here in these premises to remember those who have served, acknowledging that at 3 o'clock in the nation, there will be a national moment of silence for these veterans and these loyal Americans.
And now taps will be played. We will conclude the program with the singing of My Country 'Tis of Thee. You may be seated. That concludes our program, but please stay seated for a minute. Pat is coming in. She will have a few words to all of us.
As always. Thank you. This is a day of remembrance, a day of thanks for those who have gone on before us, and a day of praise to those of you who have served and suffered. And more than anything, we have been doing this for almost a dozen years. And if it weren't for Gretchen, we wouldn't be here. So this is our moment of applause and gratitude for
Thank you very much for attending.